So we'll go ahead, Jeff, if I ask you to just briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll get going. So invite onto stage. You should now have a little button or a little thing to accept. There we go.
So I guess I just wanted to start by kind of explaining how I met Darren. And, we about 2 months ago both attended a symposium by the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And Darren, I believe, was a co-sponsor. And it was, I guess, a 4-day event, 3 or 4 day event. And it had to do with, parapsychological phenomenon, including near-death studies, past life experiences. I found it to be extremely comprehensive, very, very professional. It was fascinating. And so I would recommend anybody who's watching this now or listening to this and who has an interest in that kind of thing, to go to the website, the IN's website, and some of this, Darren, you can send out links to these various things. And it's available for purchase, this symposium, the entire symposium, which is really quite extraordinary. It's available for purchase really for a very small fee. I don't know exactly what it is, but I feel very strongly that it's quite worth it. It put together a lot of professional scientists of various disciplines, psychologists, neuroscientists, and a lot of very accomplished people who have been studying this for many years. And it was extremely convincing, and it really went through a number of very fascinating cases by people who are, again, professionals like physicians who have themselves had near-death experiences. And that's not the point of what I wanted to go over today, but I did want to mention how Darren and I kind of met. And in fact, in addition to that, there's also something called the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. And Darren, again, I know you're familiar with it, so perhaps you want to send out a link to that, because it has 29 essays, which are extremely compelling, and about various types of parapsychological phenomenon. Largely, I think the main one, of course, is the near-death experiences. And they're very compelling. And in fact, if you do a little research, you'll find that it reveals a staggering number of cases of near-death experiences, past life experiences, clairvoyance, and other phenomena that are often difficult to categorize necessarily, but it's really compelling. And, over the years, these studies, which have been conducted for now, a good 50, 60 years by University of Virginia, and have been documented. And they provide a significant amount of evidence for the survival of consciousness after death. I was left after that symposium feeling like, I don't think it feels impossible to deny that this phenomenon takes place. So, if you talk about the ones who deny it, that it takes place, versus the hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people who have actually firsthand experience of this, they basically say that this can all be explained because of the brain and the function of the brain and that kind of thing. But it doesn't take much to realize, and I looked it up, the Mayo Clinic says that the brain is about 60% fat. The remaining 40% is a combination of water, protein, carbohydrates, and salt. That's what the brain is. And so while scientists or materialists assert that these experiences, not just some of them, but all of them, can be explained by some sort of hallucination that occurs at the time of death, well, that seems pretty unlikely. And, because so many of them, of course, talk about information that is not currently known to the experiencer, like, somebody who's in a near-death experience, or when I say near-death, where actually they're clinically dead and they're able to see things and experience things that can be later verified, which are not occurring in the room. And so, I was left with this, look, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that consciousness survives death. It's overwhelming. And I thought, well, how much more time do we want to spend building cases? And frankly, how many people? So if we have now, let's say we have 500,000 cases that have been studied, and a certain percentage of people are unconvinced, will it really do much to add another 50,000 or 100,000 cases? I don't think it's going to do much. So I think it's worthwhile at least accepting as a working hypothesis that that consciousness does indeed survive death. And if we believe also that there have been past life experiences, which are also extremely well documented, voluminous, and they have been verified using various techniques, it means that there was life prior to the current incarnation. And if we look at that, then we have to kind of say, well, and we're all taking this now. I'm offering this as a working hypothesis, something that I feel is extremely compelling, and which scientists, they have no way of refuting. In other words, they can just say it's impossible, but really, they scientists, after 150 years of exploring this, really have absolutely no way to tell us how subjective experience can result from simply the components of the brain that I mentioned previously. So I think I'd like to start by saying, let's take this as a working hypothesis and see where it takes us. And what I mean by that is that past life experiences talk about something that occurred before our current incarnation, and near-death experiences are indicative of something that occurs after we die. So you'd have to ask the most obvious question that occurs to me is, well, why did we make this pit stop? We had a life prior, and I don't know many people, and we have the current incarnation, and we know there's going to be something afterwards. So it's in all likely going to be another incarnation. Otherwise, this was an extremely unique experience that we went from a past life to a current life, and then all of a sudden, that's going to end. And so I started to think, well, this was an amazing symposium offering tremendous evidence of what I've just stated. But what do we do about that? How does that help us? What does that do for our current lives? And what does it do for us if we're trying to prepare for death? Which I think is, if we know it's coming and we know something's going to happen, is there anything we can do to prepare for it? And I think those are the important questions for anybody who is, again, accepting this as a working hypothesis. And that's when I think we pivot to Buddhism. I have studied Buddhism for 20 years, and I have been a serious practitioner. I have received teachings from incredible masters, including the Dalai Lama and a lot of other Tibetan masters of various schools of Buddhism. But this dovetails nicely into Buddhism, because Buddhism does, in fact, believe in what we call rebirth. You can call it reincarnation. I don't want to get to, some of the terminology is a little bit off-putting, and people don't like it because sometimes it interferes with what they believe must be religiously true through their training. So let's just say we can see this as a cycle. You go from a past life to a current life to a future life. To me, that sounds very much like rebirth and reincarnation, but we can certainly call it as a cycle. In fact, Buddhism does refer to it as what is called cyclic existence, the idea that we're going to go from one to the other to the other. And Buddhism has one of the most detailed explanations of what's going on, why it's going on, what we should do about it. And so that's, I guess, what I wanted to talk about a little bit today and see if it resonates with anybody. But Buddhism essentially talks about two forces that continue to propel us through this cycle of existence, this repetitive rebirth. And the basic teaching, the first teaching that the Buddha gave was on what's called the Four Noble Truths. And it had to do with his observation of suffering in this world and the understanding that there is a cause for suffering. And that's a very important thing in Buddhism, is understanding everything happens with a cause. And that's the idea of causality is something that, of course, modern science has embraced. We don't always use the same terms for it, but I think essentially what we can say about that is that both science and modern science and Buddhism, which essentially established some of these things 2,500 years ago, to say they're ahead of the curve is kind of an understatement, is that nothing happens causelessly. And if you give it a little thought, there is really nothing that you can think of that happens without a cause. We might not know the cause. We might not be able to identify the cause. The cause might, be multiple causes. There may be, there may be a number of components to these causes, and what's called cooperative causes. There's, but it happens with a cause, including suffering. All of suffering happens with a cause. And that was a revelation, because the wonderful thing about knowing that suffering happens with a cause is that if we can identify the cause for suffering, and there is a whole, I'm summarizing here, and the purpose is to bring some of this, which can be a little daunting, really, the study of Buddhism. I'm summarizing it, really. But if we can identify the causes for suffering, then at least we have a hope of actually eliminating suffering. Now, Buddhism has a lot of information about the various types of suffering. Some people might say, I'm not suffering, I'm in good health. And, I have money, I have a house, I have those things, so I'm not suffering. Well, that's not the only kind of suffering that really exists. And I think that it doesn't take much, but we should perhaps get into that in the future, the various types of suffering, which is the suffering that we can relate to. There's something called the suffering of change. As things change from one thing to another, we see that what pleased us initially is no longer a source of happiness, but becomes a source of either suffering or some other disturbing emotion. And then there's something that's a little bit more complicated, but it's called pervasive conditioned suffering. And that is the very existence of our minds and our bodies in this realm of human existence itself is in some way unsatisfactory. And I just want to kind of lay that out there because it's important. It's the Four Noble Truths. It's the first teaching of the Buddha. And it is essentially what I like to call the problem we're trying to solve. And I think every religion or every undertaking, should have some idea of what problem we're trying to solve. We're not just doing this so that we can have rituals and wear robes and go to retreats and do all kinds of things. There's actually a goal here, and that goal has to do with to address human suffering. And it's not just human suffering, of course. There's suffering of other realms of beings, including animals, which is easy to see. So the next of the Noble Truths, the third Noble Truth, which says the cause of suffering, I'm going to skip to the chase a little bit here and say that the Buddha has determined, and through observation, through reasoning and through observation, a lot of this is done through personal experience from practitioners. And it's not just the Buddha who lived 2,500 years ago, but there have been thousands and thousands of practitioners and masters who have studied, who have gone into contemplative retreats and extensive retreats, 3-year retreats where they do nothing but calm and focus their minds through meditation and do some sort of analysis and inquiry, that they've also determined that this fundamental dissatisfaction with constantly being reborn, living lives that are that contain a significant amount of suffering, and then of course the suffering of dying, old age, sickness, death. Those can be very difficult, and since there's a cause, we can do something about it. Now, I want to just explain that Buddhism has determined that the cause is really twofold. And the words that they use in order to describe the causes of suffering are delusion and karma. I'm just going to briefly explain each one, and then we're going to, the idea here was for me to take about 20 minutes and go through some of this introductory information, do a little meditation, and then if there were questions, I'd do my best to answer them. If there are questions that come up later, perhaps, Darren, you can share my email address, and I'm more than happy to do my very best to answer any questions that this might cause to arise. So I want to talk about what delusion really is talking about. Delusion is a misunderstanding of reality. It simply means that we do not see things as they really are. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has a book that says exactly that, how to see things as they really are, which I highly recommend. And it speaks to the idea that we are indeed seeing things, and that's true for internal phenomena, such as our minds, as well as external phenomena. So what we're saying, and largely what it does is it says, and this gets into a subject called emptiness. Emptiness is an extremely important, it's central to Buddhism, the idea that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. And what happens is they don't exist the way they appear, such as we ourselves see ourselves as some sort of a concrete entity when we look at ourselves and we look at what I like to call our ego, which is our sense of self. It can be defined. Definitions are kind of funny. So I'm going to say that I define our ego as our sense of self, is that what we see and what we experience as our sense of self is not what actually exists. It doesn't exist in a concrete way. And Buddhism says, don't take my word for it. If you think it exists in some sort of concrete way, then look for it and use some analysis and look for what it is that is your sense of self. Look at and find it somewhere. Find it, maybe it's in your body or your mind, but do a search for it. And that's actually an incredibly wonderful technique, because when we meditate, first we have to identify very, very specifically, very clearly, what is this sense of self? What is this ego? What is this I which we're seeking? And I think that we can call this seeking I meditation at this point. So what is this I that we're seeking? Well, let's take a look. The I that I'm talking about is that which feels very, very concrete, that which is unchanging, that which we had when we were kids, and it still exists. But if you really, really begin to look at that I, and that I becomes very, very apparent when anybody accuses us of something or something like that. That's actually a technique that's used in order to identify what we call the object of negation. It's a technique to be used. So if you imagine yourself being accused of something, especially being wrongly accused of something, you can feel something go on inside you saying, me? I didn't do that. That's not me. And that identification right there, that self, is something that doesn't exist inherently. It's not something that's there. If it did exist inherently, we'll find it on meditation. If we really do an analysis, we should be able to find that. And so that's what delusion is. It's saying, I'm not seeing the true nature of reality. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing it at a very superficial level. I'm seeing it in fact, it's a lie. What I'm saying, the idea that when I mention the word Darren, something happens inside that says, oh, me, and that thing that appears is a very, very strong, concrete, unchangeable thing that really doesn't exist. And that is the basis of a lot of our trouble. And so part of the analysis that we do as Buddhists during meditation is to do some inquiry, generally Buddhist, now talking about, and I want to mention karma too. A lot of people say, oh, I know what karma is. But it's been misused. It's karma, which strictly means action, I think is really misused in the West. It's been used very cavalierly to essentially say when anything bad happens, well, that's karma. That's your karma, as if we can really. Karma is an extremely complex confluence of circumstances, what they call causes and conditions, but it's something that happened that was caused in some way previously and has yet to ripen. And when the causes and conditions are conducive for karma to ripen, then certain things happen. And that's essentially what karma is. Now, of course, we know there's negative karma, there's positive karma. Negative karma leads to suffering conditions. It's not hard to see when we really begin to meditate and think about this. And positive karma leads to happiness. But once it has ripened, it's that karma has been what they call exhausted. And since we have lived over and over, we began by talking about this being a cycle of existence. Well, Buddhism posits that we have lived many, many lifetimes. In fact, they call it beginningless. That's a hard concept to wrap our minds around because it's hard to believe that we've been around since beginningless time. At least that which transmigrates has been around. Obviously, this body that we have has not been around, but that which transmigrates. So, in other words, after death, something transmigrates. We can call that consciousness. We can call that mind. We can call that, and Buddhism has a load of additional terms for it. But let's just call it that which transmigrates in, because I like the way that the Dalai Lama uses that. But the idea is, in order to be able to, getting back to what I said originally about what we can do with this information that a lot of the parapsychological phenomena point to, is that we can, ultimately, our goal is to break this cycle. It's not desirable at all, this cycle of having to be reborn, to go through the struggles of being a baby who can't speak for themselves, to go on and deal with all the suffering. And it's not hard to see what's going on in the world. And then dealing with old age, sickness, and death. Those are not necessarily desirable. Happens to be familiar to us because that's what we see, so we kind of expect it. But the Buddha is saying that that can be eliminated. And and you eliminate it by eliminating the causes of suffering, seeing things for how they are. And it's not to say, very, very important, I just want to point out something extremely important, that we're not talking about a nihilistic idea that nothing exists at all. That's, Buddhism cautions very, very deeply and emphatically against coming to that conclusion. That conclusion is a very dangerous conclusion, and it's also not true. Things obviously do exist. Buddhism simply says they do not exist in the manner they appear, as some sort of concrete, independent, self-sustaining phenomenon. It doesn't appear that way. Buddhism uses terms like dependent arising or dependent origination to explain how things actually arise and how they exist on what's called a conventional level. So I just wanted to start with that a little bit and then talk about what we are originally talking about, which is, what is it that actually migrates? What survives death? What is that? And if we obviously, it's not our bodies. It has to be our mind. And then when you talk about, well, what does that really include? What is the mind and how is it described? And again, it's Buddhism has a very, very sophisticated, very mature, I would say. I don't know of any other, I don't call it a religion. I call it Buddhist science. I call it Buddhist philosophy, but I won't call it a Buddhist religion because it uses what I believe to be very sophisticated scientific techniques, including first-person observation and contemplative reviews. And I believe that, what Buddhism does is it gives us the skill to be able to take a look more deeply at some of this, and especially looking into the nature of the mind, what it really is. So I'm going to try to describe it, but you can imagine, since the mind is non-physical, it's not going to lend itself so clearly to the vocabulary that we're used to. It is always described, not the mind necessarily, but emptiness and various goals which we're looking to achieve, as indescribable and almost inconceivable to people who have our limited view because of the realm that we're born into and those kinds of things. We don't have an easy way to be able to communicate. Essentially, we're trying to communicate the inconceivable. And that almost sounds like folly, but it's necessary. So the mind is frequently referred to as that which is clear and aware. And the idea behind the meditation is to begin to suppress, or to transcend is a better word, the thoughts and the constant distractions that we're having, and begin to get ourselves to a point where we can actually look below those thoughts, transcend those thoughts, those distractions, and look at what's underneath. And what's underneath is really referred to and described as that which is clear and aware. Also, it's called something called luminous and knowing, clear light, those kinds of things. But there are as you can imagine, there are layers of mind, and Buddhism recognizes that by saying there is the gross mind, which we're all familiar with, a subtle mind, and then a very subtle mind. And our idea is to get to the subtlest level of mind and rest in that. And then once we're able to do that, once we're able to achieve, and Buddhist meditation is usually described generally as two sections. One is what's called calm abiding, and the other is special insight. Now, calm abiding is simply the process of increasing our concentration by eliminating, or perhaps more accurately, ignoring distractions or transcending our thoughts. So that can be done using a variety of techniques. We'll try one out today. And there are those which are more effective, less effective. Some of it really depends on your own, on every individual. And the other is special insight. So there's calm abiding and special insight. Calm abiding reduces our distractions and allows us to increase our focus and concentration. And then when we've achieved a level of that, we begin to do inquiry. We try to analyze, also known as analytical meditation. What are we analyzing? Well, we're analyzing various subjects that are important in order to understand the Buddhist worldview. One could be the idea of impermanence. Another could be compassion and altruism, which is hard to overstate the importance of compassion and altruism, because for various reasons. One is it recognizes the reality of interdependence, which is again something that is probably a subject worth delving into more deeply and meditating on. But it's also compassion is a force. So we have forces right now that prevent us from seeing reality. Those are frequently referred to, I'm going to use another weird Buddhist term called adventitious stains. The word adventitious, and I'm using some of this terminology because as you go further into your studies, you're going to hear it. And I think it's important to be not, overwhelmed or confused or taken aback by some of this stuff. But adventitious simply means it's not inherently a part of, it was caused somehow. So this, what we call the stains that obscure our ability to be able to see reality as it is, those are called adventitious stains. Those are caused, and we indeed can transcend those adventitious stains. We have to, it helps to be able to reduce those, and some of the reduction can be achieved through what they call preliminary practices. And that's just as you would prepare a wall for painting by sanding and spackling and priming. If you don't do any of that and you just lay a coat of paint on there, it's not going to look very good and it's not going to last very long. And the same thing with this. If we don't do some of the preliminary practices, which frequently are the cultivation of selfless love, compassion, altruism, generosity, those loosen the grip on our ego of what we experience it as an independent I. They act as antidotes or opposing forces to these stains. So it's not just simply like we're going to sit down, we're going to meditate without anything other than what I've just said, and we're going to make tremendous progress and become enlightened and liberate ourselves. So it's work. It's work because we have been habitually accustomed to not doing that and to just reacting to what we see. whether it's a driver cutting us off or whether it's an unpleasant image or thought or a task. That's what we have been habitually, and it's not just a habit from this lifetime, it's a habit from what we call beginningless lifetime. So it's not going to be simple, but it is extraordinarily worthwhile. And so these antidotes are really antidotes that we need to do, and there are various ways of doing it, various techniques, exchanging self and others. They've been written by Buddhist masters and proven over the centuries, in fact, millennia, how we can reduce the forces that obscure our vision and get to a point where we're able to actually do meditation. So it's obvious too that if we want to understand the mind or the consciousness or that which transmigrates and survives death, there's really only one place we can look for that. We can only look internally. This can only be done through introspection. It can't be done by looking outside. It can't be done by going to a teaching. It can't be done through any kind of bestowing of an empowerment or something like that, which is another thing that Buddhism does, and it's a separate subject how that works. But there's sutra and tantra, and empowerments generally fall into the category of tantric practice. But so let's get into, if we can, just a quick meditation and how you get to that level of meditation. And generally speaking, when we begin a meditation, it's a tradition in Buddhism to set your intention. And it's essentially saying, look, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be free from suffering. Not only do I want to be free from suffering, but when I have been able to achieve that, I want to take it on myself to help other people to be free from suffering. So that is an intention. And there are, so we want to intend, that's important to kind of set that out and then also say, look, I'm going to take the next 15 minutes or so that you and I are going to meditate together right now. I'm going to take that and I'm going to say, everything that I had to do in the past, I'm not going to think of. Everything that I have to do in the future, I'm not going to think of, whether it's emails or Facebook or other tasks or errands. We're going to just take this time, this 15 minutes or so, and we're going to give ourselves the permission to focus deeply on our own minds and our own efforts right now. So one of the most important instructions I ever heard, and it's so simple, and I heard it from the Dalai Lama, was when you begin meditation is determine that you're not going to chase after things that have happened in the past, nor are you going to chase after things that may come in the future. But what we're going to do simply is rest in the present moment. So let's take this moment. We're going to begin the meditation. And this is a signal to say that essentially now let's concentrate on the current moment. So at this point, I would ask you to sit comfortably, whether you're sitting in a chair or whether you're sitting on a cushion, to relax your body, get yourself comfortable in your position. If you have a favorite chair, and I'm sure at some point, if you develop a meditation practice, you're going to have either a favorite chair or a cushion, and you want to be comfortable. There are lots of recommendations for physical posture during this. The most important thing in my view is that you're comfortable, you're not straining. There are some recommendations that try to make sure that whatever posture you take, your subtle winds are not obstructed. And probably the one that strikes me the most is essentially to sit up straight. And And also with regard to your eyes, some people actually meditate with their eyes open. I like to meditate with my eyes loosely shut. And at this point, it's important to be physically relaxed because undoubtedly there's a connection between the body and the mind. We already know that some people say that the body, such as the brain, causes consciousness, but I think it's pretty clear to say that correlation, which is that the brain does correlate on some level or interact with the mind, does not actually prove causation. So I don't think that we have to worry about that. But the body is important when meditating. So we're going to relax the body, and we do that by scanning ourselves for any tension. And we can frequently begin at our head and work our way down. And so I ask you now to go through your body, piece by piece, slowly, beginning at the head, and release any tension that you feel in your head, your face, your neck. And we let that just melt away. We just completely allow any tension, any physical tensions in those areas to simply melt away. Relax them. And then we go down further through our shoulders, our neck, our backs, our stomachs, our arms. We want to make sure that we are completely loose and relaxed without any tension. And do this to the very best of our ability, without judgment on how perfect we do this. And then our legs, our feet, until our body is really relaxed. And whenever we need to, we can turn our attention back and say, okay, I'm feeling tension, and I want to relax that portion of my body. But it's very important to be relaxed physically, because that has an effect on our mind and our ability to relax mentally. And at this point, the advice is to focus our mind, our attention on our breathing. And that means to take nice, even breaths through our nose. Generally speaking, we breathe through our nose when we're meditating. To try to breathe deeply in through our nose and out through our nose. And to focus our mind on the wind that goes in through our nose, fills up our lungs, and we exhale and it goes out through our nose. So let's take a few seconds, perhaps 60 seconds, to focus our mind on our breathing. You can feel the wind entering our nose. We can feel that filling up our lungs, our stomach expands. And when we feel our minds straying from this concentration, which is going to happen, it happens a lot. It happens to everybody. It's not unusual. It happens to advanced meditators. The solution is so simple. It's simply to say, oh, okay, I lost the concentration on my breath. Let me bring my concentration back to my breath. Doesn't mean I'm a bad meditator. Doesn't mean I can't do this. It simply means you're human. And without judgment, we simply bring our attention back to our breath. So let's do that. for about 60 seconds in silence. It becomes easier the more we practice. But there are distractions, tremendous amount of distractions. The idea is to remain in the present moment and continue to focus our attention on the breath. There's nothing magical about the breath. It's what we're calling for today the object of meditation. It could be on a picture of some sort of religious, if you're religious and think a focusing on Jesus, an image of Jesus or the Buddha. That works as well, but in the beginning it's frequently recommended that we do the breath. Thoughts are not the enemy of meditation, and that's important to say. Thoughts are a natural phenomenon that we're not trying to suppress. Our job is just to relax the mind that is generating the thoughts. In fact, we're transcending the thoughts. We're simply not following them. Following them is something we want to avoid. This is a natural state. You may think of thoughts as waves on the ocean. Where do they come from? Where do they go? They naturally come from the ocean, and they subside back into the ocean. Thoughts naturally are generated through the mind, and they actually subside back into the mind itself. The mind being that which is clear and aware, luminous and knowing. Space-like, in fact. And now what we want to do, that we focused on our breathing to establish our concentration. We focused on our mind itself to allow us to get an inkling, a glimpse into what underlies our thoughts. And now we want to turn our attention. This is the inquiry portion, the analytical portion of special insight. We want to take a look and see if we can find somewhere in us the I. This is called the seeking I meditation. This I, this solid, unitary, concrete self, this ego, this identity that seems to come with us without any effort on our part. Can we find this I in our body somewhere? And so we go about looking for this I somewhere in our physical form. We can do an exhaustive search for the I. We can look for it in our arm, our legs, our hearts, our brains. This ego, this I, this self, this sense of self. And the usual conclusion is that we don't see it at all in our body. Proof of it is if we lose if we lose a limb, such as an arm, we still have a sense of I. We know, in fact, if our whole body, including our brain, is decaying, or just it comes to an end, we've already established that there is something that continues. So this I can't be found in the body anywhere. Then we begin to look in the mind. Where in the mind does this I exist? By itself, does it exist somewhere? If it does it have a shape? Does it have a color? Does it have a location? These are questions that we ask ourselves during analytical meditation. We try to find the I, this inherently existent, unchanging I. We look for it over and over again. This isn't an exercise we do once. But with the concentration that we've developed, transcending attention to thoughts, we deeply analyze where this I comes from. This is known as meditation on selflessness. It is a central practice of Buddhism and central to undermine the delusion, the misperception, the superimposition that we place on this particular internal phenomenon known as the mind. We take that, we embellish it, we reify it, and it's not hard to find out or to see how that actually causes us problems. This reification, this ego, very easy to see that all of our disturbing and destructive emotions are tied to this superimposed I that we have established. Very easy to see how jealousy and anger arise from this superimposition of an actual solid I. Once we have established that superimposition as something concrete, then our instincts tell us to defend it because it's something that can be destroyed. If it exists, it can be destroyed. It can be harmed by somebody speaking harshly to us, somebody accusing us. But the key to understand is that if you can't find it, it doesn't exist the way it appears to us. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all. Of course, we have a mind, we have personalities, but ultimately, and Buddhism makes a distinction between what's called conventional reality and ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is the final analysis, the final view. So let's take a moment now, maybe 2 minutes, to relax with our relaxed mind. See if we're able to identify, to locate this unchanging ego, this sense of self, this identity, that which needs to get defended. See if we can identify that somewhere. So, some thoughts in conclusion. One is, of course, a tradition that we have in Buddhism, which I think is wonderful, and I don't preserve all the traditions, a lot of the rituals and ceremonies and those things that feel like they are relevant only to those who are very religious are not things that I necessarily embrace in my practice. But one of them is, and I said, set our intention in the beginning. Well, another one is a dedication of some sort. It helps us to really make this a much more meaningful thing. It helps us to establish karmic causes for success in future practices. And dedicating this work to the happiness of others is something that is an extremely powerful, again, can't be overstated. The compassion, the altruism, all based on reality, that every single happiness that we ever experience, from the moment we're born to the moment we die, every single happiness that we have is attributable to others in our lives. These are not things that happen in a vacuum. We don't experience that in a vacuum at all. And so a nice dedication is to say, I have spent this half hour or 40 minutes, and I wish to dedicate this to my full enlightenment so I can be of the greatest benefit to all sentient beings. That's something you're going to hear over and over when you talk about Buddhist meditation. And it's a wonderful, absolutely wonderful thing. Very, very powerful. Again, and it's an antidote. The more altruism, the more generosity, the more patience, the more what they call the 6 perfections we're able to develop and maintain. The more force we have to eliminate and overcome our habitual tendencies, which is to narrowly conceive this conceptuality that we have. Such a narrow concept of things. it helps to really, really dissolve that, to weaken that. And that's so important because it widens our mind. It makes it more encompassing. And so dedicating our efforts to either the benefit of others or simply to our own advancement in our practices for the purpose of benefiting others is an extremely powerful thing to do. So I guess the last thing I want to say really is that after 20 years of very intense study, very intense practice, I still consider myself a beginner, a novice, a student. I'm no means a scholar or a master or anything like that. But what I think is the most important thing that I've learned, or the most helpful thing that I'm able to do, and I try to do it on a regular basis, is to be mindful in my daily activities and to trace every single disturbing emotion that I have as real time as possible back to what's called its self-grasping root. That's a little profound, probably not hard to understand, but when I feel jealous or I feel angry or I feel anxious, I am absolutely certain at this point that I can trace that back to some sort of a egocentric view, which is dependent on an inherently existent self that I grasp at. And by over and over looking at what that self is or what that self is not, it helps to actually diffuse the situation in real time. So the question of how is that helpful to us in this lifetime? Well, it provides an extraordinary way of creating a more peaceful mind where things simply don't bother us like they do. We have a greater concern for others. And it actually helps us to begin to see reality in a much clearer way, how things are interdependent and how things don't really exist in the manner they appear. So what I would guess we would do, I'll turn this back over to Darren. I hope that this was helpful in some way as a good introduction. It goes a little deeper than many other introductions, but I'll turn this over to Darren. If any, I don't know if there's anybody on here that might have a question for me. If you do, that's fantastic. I'd be happy to try my best to answer it. If you don't, and you can think of something later, or Darren, if you send this out or this recording to people and they're able to take the time to listen to it and they have any questions, they should feel free to email me at the address that you have, Darren, and I'd be more than happy to do my best to answer those questions.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the, as you say, very profound introduction to Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. Nikki says she just wanted to say thank you, Jeff. I've just completed the meditation along with you and I nearly fell asleep. I felt so relaxed. And she also asks, how often would you meditate? Is it at set times each day?
My recommendation for people is to do it daily and to do it at a time where there are very few distractions. That's usually, I think it's kind of universally agreed that that's very early in the morning. For me, I'm an early morning person, so I do that. I get up quite early. It could be 4 o'clock in the morning for me, but it's not, if that's not comfortable or if you don't feel alert or you can do that, then any time where you have fewer distractions and can really take 20 minutes and say to yourself, I'm not going to think about Facebook or Wordle. I don't know if you guys do Wordle, but I'm not going to do any of that stuff because it's going to be there when I get back and I don't have to worry about it. And in fact, I'm going to take this time and I'm going to, this is a sacred time to actually begin to train my mind in a way. So I would say daily, certainly, and the more often you do it. I would have to say that I personally have been doing 3 sessions a day. As far as the length of those sessions, it can vary. Anything under 15 minutes doesn't really seem like it's something that is going to do much good. And you can work your way up from there. It really depends. So I'm glad that you were able to relax. Falling asleep is not the point, but it in fact can be a very, very pleasant experience. The idea here, though, is to solve a problem. And that's not just to relax temporarily while you meditate. The problem is freeing ourselves from the cycle of suffering, liberating ourselves that we don't have to reincarnate unless we're doing so for altruistic reasons. And so it's essentially liberating ourselves from this cycle of suffering that we find ourselves in.